Everyone is here. So I'm going to get started. Um, I want to begin with a little bit of review as well as homework as usual. However, this time, the homework from last week, I got submissions from about a third of the class, which was a little bit lower than I was hoping. So I could tell that we definitely went a little bit faster last week. So I want to take a little bit extra time just reviewing and making sure everyone feels comfortable with what we've covered so far. And so to do that, let me start with my screen share. And I'm going to open up my Eclipse if my computer will stop freezing. It's a little bit, uh, there we ooh, there we go. It freezes a bit when I start screen sharing, but here we go. Um, what we covered last week was talking about how to get user input for the most part, which we did using the scanner class or the scanner object. And we learned how to use it both for user input. So you as the person who's running the program can type in stuff and it gets sent to your program, as well as file input, where you can read a text file on your computer, or really any file actually, and use it inside your program as well. And so I want to go over the homework kind of step by step. I'm going to try to ask people to help me complete it. And through this, hopefully, we feel a little bit more comfortable. I started off just the first line that's going to be needed, which is the scanner itself, which is what we use to get input. And as a reminder of what the program is supposed to do, there were two parts. The first is writing a function that can take in a name of a file that you want to read, and it just prints out whatever's inside that file. The second part is using that function or method, right? So we write the method, but if we don't use it, then it's not very useful. So the second part was using the method. And for that, we wanted to get user input by asking the user to type in a file name, and then we send that file name to the method that we wrote, and then it does all the magic, right? And so to tackle this, I actually want to start like kind of the opposite direction. I want to start with the user input and then do the file input later, because I think the file input is a little bit trickier one. But here I have almost just a fresh Java class that I've created. The only line that I've added so far is this scanner sc equals new scanner system.in, and then this import statement, right? So these are the two lines that I've really added in. This is just a demonstration. It's not really part of the solution, or it's not needed at all. But let me just really quickly copy this into the chat for everyone. And if you haven't already, please open up your Eclipse as well so you can follow along. And I want everyone, especially if you didn't do this over the week, to try to follow along and do this with me. But anyways, really quickly, I want to ask, does anyone remember like what system.in is for? Like, why don't we have something else here? Why do we put system.in? What does it mean? Sort of. Or in general, what is the purpose? So I can explain it really quickly. So what's inside the parentheses is basically telling you, or telling the scanner, where to look for input. Here we're telling the scanner to say, hey, go to system.in, right? That's where you're going to find all the inputs coming in. And what you may or may not have remembered is system.in just refers to essentially this area in Eclipse. You can think of it like that. And why I bring this up is later on when we do file input, we're not going to put system.in inside the parentheses anymore. We're going to put the file because we don't want it to look at this area for input. We want it to look at the file, right? And so I think that's the most confusing part of this line, but let me just run through it in its entirety. We start off not very special, right? We're creating a scanner object. So just like any other variable, we have the type and we have some variable name. So here, the type is scanner. This I can't change. This I have to keep. This thing is just the name of it. I can call the scanner pretty much whatever I want. I could call it X, I could call it ASDF, I could call it Bob. I just called it SC, short for scanner, right? I'm going to refer to this line. I just have this kind of as a similarity. So here, when we're creating integer arrays, hopefully this is a little bit more familiar. We have the same pattern, right? The data type, here it's an int array, here it's a scanner. And then this is the variable name, ARR. And then this is the variable name, SC, right? So it matches up. Then we have the equals, and then whatever the thing is. So here we're saying a new int array. Here we're saying a new scanner, right? The only thing that's different is kind of the input when you're creating this thing. For integer arrays, it's different, it's weird. You put the size of the array inside the square brackets. It's just, that's how arrays work. You use the square brackets. For almost everything else, you're not going to use these square brackets, right? Square brackets are pretty much only for arrays. Here we do the parentheses, right? So we say new scanner and then parentheses system.in. You can think of this is actually just a method, right? We learned about methods in the second class. The method name is scanner and the parameters or the input is system.in. Right? You can think of it like that. And we're actually going to see that's exactly how it works. But anyways, this creates our scanner object. Can anyone help me and tell me, how do I use this scanner to get some input from the user? How do I ask the user to type in a file name, for example? And how do I read in that information? So if I don't get any volunteers, I will call on people that I see in the Zoom participants list. So last chance for volunteers.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so I've created this scanner object, and now I want to use it to ask the user to type in a file name and store it. How do I do that? Okay, so I see your question, Andrew, first. Let me delete this really quickly. So this is kind of the template for creating a scanner. You have the type, you have the variable name, and then you're making a new scanner, right? This is your base. But this isn't enough. You need to add one extra piece of information inside the parentheses. And the thing that you need to add is basically, where is this scanner taking in the input, right? We know we're using the scanner to get stuff from the user, to get stuff from the file, but how does the scanner know where to look, right? You tell it by putting it inside the parentheses. And so we just say system.in, and this is something that you can just copy paste. This is just a special place that refers to kind of your console where you can type things in later on. Christopher, I see your chat, scanner.next line. Yeah, no problem, Andrew. I like your answer, although there's something that's just a little bit off. I agree we want to use this next line method, but I don't like the thing before the period, before the dot. what should be before the dot? SC, yeah. Thank you, Andrew, for
Yeah,
filling in.
SC. Yeah, I missed
Yeah.
that.
No problem. It's just a minor thing, but the important thing is the next line method, which you got. So here we use the object that we just created, right? We created the scanner called SC, and we're going to use it. That's the whole purpose of this first line, to use it later on. So we say SC, and then scanners, if you remember, have a whole bunch of useful methods. You can take in an integer, you can take in a string, you can take in a Boolean, you can take in a double. It has all these different things. And in general, it's like next whatever. So you can do sc.next Boolean, sc.next int, sc. In this case, next line. And what next line does is it takes a whole line of text. So not just a single string, but everything up until like a new line character, or when you hit enter, basically. And so this will use the scanner to take in a line, but we need to add something in front of it. We need to store it somewhere. And to do this, we can just create just any other string variable. So like string, I'm going to call it file name equals sc.nextLine. And for now, since we don't have the code to actually print out whatever's in the file, I'm just going to print out this variable just to show that it's working so far. And so if we do this, if I run, oops, ignore that, we can type something in. So let's just type Joe. If I hit enter, it'll say Joe back, right? So you can see it's kind of doing what we told it to do. This green is my text, what I typed in. And then the black is printing it back out, because that's all our program is doing so far. It's taking in a line and then right after just printing it back out. So nothing interesting so far. What I do want to make a note of is, if you noticed when I ran this program, it's a little bit confusing because nothing shows up, right? Nothing is telling me to type in something. And so to solve that, all we have to do is just add a print statement before the next line method, right? Before we try to take in a line, we just send a prompt out. So we just say system.out.print, and then like enter a file name, for example. So now when I run it, you can see it prints out the message and then it waits for my next line. And so I can say Joe now, and then prints Joe back out. You don't have to worry about this prompt being part of this next line thing. When you say sc.nextLine, it's starting to read right here, right? After the message, right? Yeah. So with this, we're ready to go to writing the method to output the contents of a file. And so that's another part I want to just quickly go over, how to write methods. I'm going to start it off with what I said. Every method is going to begin with, at least for this class, and then next class, we're going to see something different, I promise. But every method that we've done so far starts with public and static. And then, okay, so I see your message, Marilyn. Can you tell me what the error says, or actually, can you take the screen share and I can take a look at the error message that's going on? Yeah, so Andrew has the correct answer. It's print ln, not 1n. Yeah, it does look similar, but hopefully that should fix things. Yep. And a reminder, hopefully everyone else is following along with what I'm typing on the screen, but if you run into any problems, feel free to just message and we can take a look together or resolve it in some other way. And yeah, sorry about that. The L and the 1 do look very similar to each other. And it's just, sometimes in some editors, they actually look exactly the same. Like you can't tell the difference. In Eclipse, they're very similar, but you can tell if you take a look. But I agree, it's very confusing. Yeah. But anyways, back to writing the method. We have public and static. Can anyone tell me what goes after these modifiers? What's the next kind of section of the method definition? And to clarify, I'm not looking for what I should type in. I'm asking for like, what kind of information should I put here after public and static? And as a hint, you can look at, this is one example of a method definition. What is this void? What did we call this? Like, what's the job of this?
The return type.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. It's the return type. So what does this method produce as output? And so void is the only weird one, where void just means it doesn't produce any output. Maybe it prints stuff, maybe it just does some calculations directly, maybe it modifies stuff and doesn't need to return anything. That's why you use void. In our case, our method is supposed to take in a file name and print out all the contents. Do we need to return anything for this method? So I guess now I'm asking, what is the return type of this method? Do we have a specific one? Are we going to return a string? Are we going to return an int? Or are we going to return nothing? How about Stephen? What do you think the return type of this method should be? And as a reminder, the method is taking in a file name and printing out the contents. That's all the method does.
I'm not sure.
Okay, no problem. So, like I said, this method takes in a file name as input. It will print out the contents of whatever's in that file, but that's all it does. So because all this method does is print stuff out, it doesn't need to return anything. There is no return value. And when there is no return value, what we say is just void, just like up here, right? If you notice inside the main method, all we're doing is creating a scanner, asking for input and printing out some words. We're not returning anything, right? We don't say return 5 or 3, for example. In fact, we can't because we said it's void. It's not going to return anything. And so looking ahead, this method is just going to be like the main. It's not going to return anything. So we just say void for the return type. After the return type here, so we have the modifiers, public static, we have the return type, void. Now we have the method name, right? So this one is called main. This one I'm going to call whatever I want. I'll just say read file. Right? This is just any name that you want. On your Eclipse, on your version, you can call it something else if you want. After the method name, I have my parentheses. Skipping ahead a little bit, I have my curly braces. Inside the parentheses are my parameters, my inputs. And so going on the list, how about Alan? How many parameters am I going to have for this method?
I don't think you need any, right?
So I will say you need one parameter. You will need the file name.
Oh, yeah.
Because, yep. So if you can help me then, I need to take in one input and it's going to be the file name. What should the type of that parameter be?
A string, probably.
Exactly. It's going to be text, so string. So that's a reminder when you're telling the parameters or the inputs to your method, you have to not only give it a name, but you also have to give it a type, just like any other variable, right? So we have to say string file name, for example, right? There's two parts of it. If we happen to want to take in multiple parameters, we just separate them by commas. So maybe we take a string file name and then maybe an int line num, for example. Maybe we modify it later to print out a specific line out of the file. That's how you do it. You have your two inputs separated by comma. And you can have as many inputs as you want. But for this one, to make it simple, all we're doing is having a single input to this method, a single string called file name. And so now, can someone help me? I want to read from this file. And so I'm going to need to make a scanner. I know I'm going to need to do that. But can someone help me? What do I need to do before I make the scanner? There's one step I need to do. And as a hint, how does the scanner know where to get the input from? Yep, thank you, Andrew. We need to create a new file object because this time, instead of reading from system.in, we're reading from a file. And so before we can create the scanner, we have to first create the file. Or I say create the file, but I don't mean like making a text file. I mean more of just like opening it up, I guess, telling Java, here's a file that you can use. And so to do that, we just create a file object. And so just like creating any other object, we have the type of it. So it's a file, capital F. And then the name of the variable. To be short, I'm just going to say F. You have your equal sign and then the file itself. So it's almost always new, and then file and parentheses. And so this looks very similar to creating a scanner. And just like creating a scanner, we need to give it some sort of input. We have to tell it the file name. And so very conveniently, that's just one of the parameters. So we can just take that and put it in there. And so here the full line is file F equals a new file given the file name. And I have some red underline because first of all, I need to import this file object. So just like I had a scanner import, I need to add a file import, right? Because again, they're available to you. Someone already took care of this. They already wrote the Java code to handle files and scanners, but you need to import it to make it available first. Otherwise, Java doesn't know what you're talking about when you say files and scanners. It's kind of like an add-on that you have to download almost. So we create this file object, and now looking at the same line from above, we're just going to create another scanner. I'm going to call this in for input. And then instead of system.in, I hinted at this before, we're not reading from system.in anymore. We're going to read from the file. And so we're just going to use the F, right? The file F that we created right above. And here is the one tricky part of reading from files. We have this error that says unhandled exceptions. And this is what I said last week very quickly. You just choose this quick fix, add a throws declaration. We're going to talk about this more in depth after the review today. We're going to talk about how to do this try catch, the second option. But anyways, I'm going to select the first quick fix, add a throws declaration. And if you notice, it adds this extra bit to your method definition. And so this, any method can declare this. Any method can declare that they will throw things. And the things that you throw, they're just all different types of exceptions or errors. And we're going to cover the different types of it. But for this case, we're saying that this method, this read file method, not only does it have a void return type, not only does it take in an input parameter of a string file name, but in addition, it will throw this exception. So what this means is it's kind of like a warning. It's a warning label. It's basically telling anyone, hey, if you want to use this method, be warned. This may cause a file not found exception error. Okay? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure, but just be prepared, right? That's what this throws is basically saying. Like, hey, I might pass up an error if you use me. But once we create the file, once we create the scanner, we can now read from the file using this next line as above. And I think everyone who turned in figured out how to read all of the lines. There's a convenient method from the scanner called hasNextLine. And so we can just say while in.hasNextLine system.out.println in.nextLine. And so actually, I'm going to split this up into 2 lines. So string line equals .next line and then print it out. So if we take a look at this, ignore the loop for a second. This should look not that scary. It's basically the same as what we have up here. We're using the scanner, we're getting the next line, storing it, and then printing it out. That's what these 2 lines of code are doing. What we want to do now is not just do it 1 time, not just do it 2 times. We want to do it as long as there are lines to read, right? As long as there's still more to my file, I just want to keep doing this. And so that's what the while loop is for. If you remember, we have while, and then inside is some sort of Boolean condition, either a true or false value. And we get this by using the hasNextLine method. And so it does what it sounds like. in.hasNextLine basically just says, hey, the scanner in, do you have a next line or do you not? True or false? And so if it has a next line, then it will just go inside the loop. But immediately once you reach the end of the file, there are no more next lines. This will be false, and then the loop stops. I see one question, private chat, in can't be resolved. So make sure you have this line of code. I'm just gonna copy what I have for now into the global chat. So you can try copying that in, or you can try to change the name of in. It shouldn't be the problem, but maybe try that. If you're getting something that says in can't be resolved or something can't be resolved, it basically just means it doesn't know what you're talking about. In this case, it's probably that you didn't actually create the scanner before doing this stuff, right? If you say in.hasNextLine without creating the scanner first, then it's going to be like, I don't know what in is. Yeah, yeah. And if you call this something else, then that's the same thing. All right, so this by itself is pretty much all we need. So now back into the main method. This line was just added for like pure testing purposes. We don't actually need to print out the file name again. Can someone tell me what I should replace this line of code with? Right? We don't care about printing out the file name. We've gotten the file name from the user. What do we do now? How do we use this method that we just wrote? How about David? Can you help me with this one? I want to use this method that I just wrote in my main method. How can I do that? You can either tell me by unmuting, or you can type in the line of code I should put in right here. Close. So we don't need to do system.out.println line. System.out.println line just prints out whatever you put inside of it. We don't need to do that. We need to use the read file method, because the read file method does all the printing for us. So what we want to do is just the name of the method, read file. And then from this definition, we can see that read file takes in a file name that's a string. Well, very conveniently, we have a string file name right here that we got from the user. And so we could just pass that right in. Right. Read file, file name. And so I'm going to ignore the red underline for now, but this is how to use the method that we just wrote. Again, the name of the method, and then whatever inputs it needs. And when you do this, when this line of code is run, what happens is Java says, oh, I know what read file is. It's this stuff right here. And so it's just gonna run through these lines of code. And this is where we do all the print line stuff. Right? So we don't need to call print line right here anymore. It's gonna be done when you run the method itself. But if we look at the red underline, why is this causing a problem still? If we hover over it, you can see unhandled exception again. And that's just because, like we said, this method read file, we added a warning label to it. We said it throws file not found exceptions, right? There's a chance that when we try to do this, it's gonna cause a problem. And so we never told Java how to deal with it, right? And Java doesn't like that. So to get around that, we just add another warning label. We just add another throws declaration, right? We just put throws file not found exception in the main method. And so this is analogous to just passing the problem along. Like, I'm not going to deal with it. Someone else will deal with it. So what happens is if this method has a problem, then it just says, okay, I give up. I'm going to toss it to my boss. Right. And then the boss might say, okay, I give up as well. I'm going to toss it to my boss. Right. And you throw it. Eventually you reach a point where you can't throw it anymore. And that's actually this main method. If the main method throws anything, your program just stops. It just gives an error message and you have to deal with the crash. But at this point, we can run the program and we can see it says enter a file name. And very conveniently, I have these text files. Notice they're not in my source folder, right? I can open and close my source folder. They're not inside of it. It needs to be in the main project directory directly. And I can say first.txt, and you can see this is what was in the file. I can run it again. I can say second.txt, and you can say, wow, you found the second file. So on like that. So I got a question saying read file is undefined. So I'm guessing that's with this line. If you're getting something that says read file is undefined, check the spellings. I said read file here because that's the name of my method. But if you called this method something else, you have to change this to match as well. Right? It just has to be the method name. In general, if you get an error message that says something is undefined, it just means it doesn't know what you're talking about. You're trying to ask for something it doesn't understand, like it can't find it. And so usually this is due to like a typo, honestly. Like if you think it should know, just check for typos and yeah. No. But with this, we've finished the homework. Again, 2 parts: getting user input, getting file input, and secondarily, how to write a method. That's what this homework was testing, and hopefully by stepping through it together, you feel a bit more comfortable with it. I will be posting this to Classroom as well, and actually the homework for this week will be building on top of this. we're going to get rid of the throws declaration and we're going to actually handle the errors properly this time. And so I did this, so there's no excuse. If you didn't do the homework this week, it's okay. I've given you a file that you can work on for this week's homework to build on top of. But if you already did it yourself and you have your own version, feel free to use that instead. Anyways, I do want to take a pause and see if people have any questions. When I type read file name, it says error and forces me to add throws file not found exception. Yep, that's exactly right, Marilyn. So if you notice, I had to add this throws file not found exception to my main. If I delete this, this is probably the same error that you're getting. Unhandled exception, add throws declaration. Again, this is because taking along this chain, this line of code, for me, line 19, when I'm creating this scanner using this file, actually really quickly, I can show you something, show the class. If you go to Java, Java doc scanner. And so this is something I showed last week. This shows you everything that you want to know and things that you probably don't want to know about scanners, right? It's a very useful source. And so if we go to this website and we search up Control F, scanner, we have to go here. These are called constructors. And so here's the constructor that we're using, scanner with some sort of file. And if we look at this, you'll notice that this constructor actually has a throws declaration in it, right? So we don't see this because someone else wrote this method for us. But when we use this right here in line 19, we're using new scanner with some sort of file. Notice this one throws a file not found exception, right? This one does not handle the errors. And so what this means is when we run this line, it says, Java says, hey, I know this line might cause a problem. You have to make sure you have a plan of dealing with it, right? This method has a warning label and you're asking me to use it. So you have to deal with this warning, this throws exception line. And so we were lazy. We said, okay, we're going to deal with it, but we're not actually going to deal with it. All we're going to do is just pass it on to someone else, right? That's one way of dealing with your problems, passing it on to someone else. It's not the best way. You should probably handle it yourself, and we're going to see how to do that. But it's a perfectly valid way for now, just to give it to someone else to deal with. And so if we follow this method just says, okay, if inside here, I happen to have a file not found exception, I'm just going to toss it. I'm going to throw it to someone else. Someone else has to deal with it. I'm out of the picture now. And so because this read file has a throws file not found exception, when we try to use it, we have to actually put it in the main as well, right? Because again, this method read file has like a warning label attached to it. We're trying to use it here. Java says, hey, you're trying to use something that might cause a problem, have to come up with a plan to deal with it. And so our plan is just to simply throw it, AKA pass it up. And then I actually can show you, this is kind of the slides. If I type in a file name that doesn't exist, right? And I hit enter, you can see this is what happens, right? This is the result of throwing the file not found exception up and up and up. And then it reaches a point where you can't throw it anymore, it just crashes. And so if you notice, it actually says exception in thread main. So it's an exception, something bad happened. When it says main, that's because of the main method. And so the exception in main was called a java.io.file not found exception, exactly the type of thing that we're throwing. And you can actually trace, it's not super clear, but basically it's saying right here, this is the stuff that's built in that you don't have to worry about. But notice it says line 19 in input.readFile. My class is called input. This is the read file method. Line 19 is exactly this line that could go wrong. And so it's saying line 19 caused a problem. I'm throwing it up to line 14, which is this line. This line threw it up and then there's no one else to catch it. And so I just stopped. And so by looking at this error message, you can actually see how the error got thrown across different places and eventually just crash your program. But really quickly, does anyone else have any questions about the homework, how it works, clarifications, anything like that? If not, I want to spend, let's see, the next 20 minutes talking about error handling. And so it's a little bit of a, it'll be a short thing, so we can cover it in the 20 minutes, but it is pretty useful. I will admit I'm lazy sometimes. I will just do this throws stuff. If I just need to do something quick and dirty, get it done, I just say throws and someone else deals with it. Try catch is what we're gonna see, how to handle it yourself, how to handle it in a little bit of a better way. I'll say this right now, it's a little bit tedious, like it's just a lot of coding for stuff that's not really interesting, but it is important because no matter how good you are, problems might happen, especially when you're dealing with users, right? You can't control what someone does with your program. And so you want to make sure that no matter what the user does, it doesn't just crash, right? Like imagine the developer for Google Chrome. You don't want Chrome to just randomly crash when someone types in something weird in the search bar, right? You want to make sure you handle all these things. And so that's why it's important, but it's not very fun. But the first couple slides just show you different types of errors. So here's one where you're using the scanner, and it's asking for an int, and it actually says next int. But then if you type in a letter, this is going to cause a problem. Similarly, if you try to divide by 0, it's going to cause another problem. If you have an array and you try to access something that's out of bounds, this is going to cause a different type of problem, right? I think this one we've seen before very briefly, called the array index out of bounds exception. I can show this 0 division error really quickly because it's easy to show. But for example, if I'm going to create a new class actually, just to keep things a little bit organized instead of being bad and having everything in one file. So new class, I call it exceptions, and I'm going to have the main method finish, and I have this new thing. I can say int x equals 6 divided by 0, just like before. And that's all I'm going to put in my program. Notice there are no red underlines, right? There's nothing telling me, hey, this is a problem, right? It's perfectly valid Java code, right? This is nothing wrong with the grammar, the syntax. But if I run it, you can see there's a problem. Exception in thread main, java.lang.arithmetic exception, divide by 0, whatever. Basically a problem. Whenever you see this red text, it means a problem. And so the question now is, how do we deal with it? Although actually jumping ahead of a little bit, just going into the definitions very briefly, there are different types of exceptions. There's checked exceptions, unchecked exceptions, and errors. And so as you can imagine, checked and unchecked are very similar to each other. Error is like a separate category. All of these things are what we call throwable. And that's why we say throws whatever, right? Because they're throwable, they're able to be thrown. So all the different types of exceptions, you can throw them. All the different types of errors, you can also throw. And so what this looks like is there's kind of an organization. We have this throwable thing. Everything is a throwable, both exceptions and errors. Under exceptions, these sorts of things, IO exception, SQL exception, class not found exception, these are what we call checked exceptions. I'm going to define that a little bit later. Runtime exceptions is the other term for unchecked exceptions. And so if you look at runtime exceptions, you'll see arithmetic exception. That's exactly what we've seen just now. this arithmetic exception. Not shown here, in Eclipse at least, we also have like the array index out of bounds exceptions. This is where if you have an array of size 3 and you try to access index 52, right? It's out of bounds. And so maybe you could make a guess, but the difference between checked and unchecked exceptions is just, are they checked before you hit the run button, right? This kind of error, this arithmetic exception, is not checked before you hit the run, right? Even though this will cause a problem, it doesn't tell you ahead of time. It only causes a problem when you run it. Exception, because it happens when you run it. On the other hand, these file not found exceptions, they go under this IO exception category. These are checked exceptions because, for example, if I didn't have this, it checks it for you before you hit the run button, right? This thing, it knows it's a problem before you hit play, right? And so that's what it means to be checked versus unchecked. Check just says when you're programming, this thing called the compiler will tell you ahead of time. It won't even let you run if you have any checked exceptions. Runtime exceptions, on the other hand, get slipped past that first check and then only show up when you actually run the program. And there's a good reason for this. A lot of the, or all the runtime exceptions, you can have perfectly fine Java code that is perfectly legal, perfectly formatted, but just if the user happens to do something weird, it will cause an exception. And so a lot of times for runtime exceptions, you don't know if it's going to cause a problem ahead of time. So you can't check them. That's why they're unchecked. It's a lot of times impossible to check. Right. Anyways, skip past this for time sake, but the last category, errors, you're not going to see this all that often, but errors are, you can think of a little bit more severe than exceptions. Errors are generally what we call irrecoverable, which basically means there's no way to handle them, right? We're going to show how to handle exceptions. They can generally be handled okay. Errors are usually more severe in the sense that if you have an error, there's nothing you can do at that point. For example, you have these like out of memory errors, virtual machine error, assertion error, stack overflow error. These are things where, for example, if you run out of memory, there's no way to recover from that. Like you run out of memory, you can't do anything anymore, right? Things that are exceptions, for example, array index out of bounds, you can recover from that. For example, hey, I try to access 33 from my array and it doesn't exist. Well, then let me just try to access 12 instead, right? There's something that you can do to try to fix it. For these errors, generally, if you get to them, there's nothing you can try at this point. You just have to give up. But so exceptions can happen anywhere. How do we handle it? And so we do something called try catch, sorry. And so if you've done Python, this is the same thing as try except, but in Java, we call it try catch. And so what this looks like is I have like kind of a template here. We have a try block. And so that's a try with curly braces. Inside the curly brace, you just have all the code that you want to try, that you want to attempt to run, that may or may not cause an error. That's what goes inside this try section. Immediately after, you have a series of catches. You can have 1, you can have 10, you can't have 0. You have to have at least one of them. And so you can just say, okay, I want to catch this sort of exception and do this stuff. I want to catch this other type of exception and then do this stuff, so on, so on, so on. You can think of it almost like a switch statement or like a if, else if, else if, else if, else kind of structure, where if something happens, you just try to match it up with the correct case to go to, right? If it's this exception, I'm going to do this. If it's this exception, I'm going to do this. If it's that exception, I'm going to do that, so on, so on, so on, right? So that's why you can have as many catches as you want. You just do different things for different errors. And then at the end, there's an optional thing that you can put, and I have it here. It's the finally block. And this is something that's always executed. And we're going to cover that soon. But what this looks like a little bit more carefully in code. Actually, I'm just going to show it with what we have in Eclipse with this tricky line that's giving me problems. I know this line might give me a problem, so I'm going to put it in a try block. So I say try, open the curly brace, close it, just a tab for formatting. If you stop here, you're going to see a problem. It's going to say syntax error. You need to insert something to finish it. So you did the try, but you need to finish it, right? Try is only half of it. You have to add the catch. So I'm just going to catch. What do I want to catch? Well, I want to catch this arithmetic exception, right? So you can think of it just like when we're doing parameters to a functions. You need the type and then you need the name. So the type is the arithmetic exception, and the name can be whatever you want. Typically, you're going to call it E, short for error or exception. And then I can have my block of code. And once I do this, even if I have nothing inside of here, I'm done, right? Like I can be done. This will now run. And so if I hit the play button, you'll notice it doesn't output anything, but that's good because before I had an error message, right? Before I had 2 lines of red text telling me, hey, something went wrong. But now when I run it, no more red text, right? It handled the exception. To make it more clear, I can say, add something in the catch, right? Instead of just doing nothing, I can say system.out.println can't divide by 0. Right? And so if I hit run now, you can see it just prints this section. Basically, what's happening is when I hit play, it's doing this main method. And when it does the main method, it first does this try section. And so it just says, okay, you're telling me to try this, I'm going to try it. And while it's trying this code, it says, oh, hey, oh no, I have a problem. I have a arithmetic exception that happens. What do I do? And so then it looks through the catches and says, oh, you told me what to do. If I have an arithmetic exception, I can catch it here and I can do this print statement and then I'm done, right? This is what it means to handle your errors. And if you haven't caught on yet, a way to remember this is in Java, we have this analogy of like throwing exceptions. So when something throws the exception, something else has to catch it. And so that's why it's called a catch, right? This line throws the exception, this line catches it. If something throws an exception, but no one catches it, that's when you get the red text. That's when you get the error that crashes your program. Because if no one catches the error, then the program can't continue, right? Just to be safe. If one error happens, it just stops before anything else could go wrong. You can put other catch statements here. So in here, in this case, we can add more catches. For example, the array index out of bounds exception. And I can do some other stuff here, blah, blah, blah. But it's not super useful in this case because it won't happen. But for example, I can add a different error message, system.out.println can't access element. And so if I, instead of my try doing this, I do instead int array arr equals new int array of 1, 2, 3, and then try to do arr 5, and I hit run. Now you can see, oops, what went wrong? I'm a little bit confused why this caused a problem. Well, I'm just going to do that instead. And now you can see, instead of doing the first catch, now it's doing the second catch, because it wasn't an arithmetic exception. I mean, nothing about this was an arithmetic exception. This was an array index out of bounds exception. So a lot of times how this works is maybe you'll be writing your program, and if it's these sort of unchecked exceptions, you run it and you get this error. It's like, oh, okay, this is something I need to handle. So then you put everything into a try, you add a catch for that specific error, and then you run it again. Maybe then it's all good. But maybe if you handle that one, there's a different error that you still need to handle. And you say, okay, there's this other file not found exception that I need to handle. And then so you just add another catch, so on, so on, so on, until everything is handled properly. Just the final things here, you can add a general catch statement. You can just catch any exception. And so here, what this does is, instead of catching a specific thing, instead of catching arithmetic exception or array index out of bounds, you're just catching any exception that might happen. And a note here is the order does matter. So you have to put this general exception catch at the very end, because when it's looking through this to find what to do when an error happens, it just does it top to bottom, and it only does one of them. And so here, if you had the general exception at the top, it would only ever do this and would never do any of these specific catch statements. That's because when it goes in order, the first one it sees, it will say, hey, it is an exception. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to ignore the rest. You don't want that. So you always have to put the more general stuff at the end. And then, like I said, you can add a finally statement. So finally, and then whatever you want, system.out.println, done, right? And so now if I hit run, you can see it catches the error and then it prints done. But if I change the code to something that doesn't cause a problem, you can see I hit run and it still prints done, right? Whether or not there's an error, the finally will always run. Whether or not there's an error that happens here, it will always run. Even if your computer program crashes somewhere else, the finally will always run. The only time the finally will not run is if your computer turns off, right? Any other case, the finally is always executed. And so that's why it's useful sometimes for this input stuff that we did for the homework. I didn't mention, but you should always do a close statement with your scanners just to save memory, avoid any leaks. Usually